New York City, the roaring 1920s. Jazz pours from smoke-filled bars, flappers dance under dim lights, and the hum of ambition vibrates through every cobblestone street. But beneath the glittering skyline lies another world, darker, hungrier, and far more organized than anyone suspects. This is the world where Charles Lucky Luciano is about to make history, not as a politician or a tycoon, but as the man who turned crime into an empire. The story begins at the intersection of two dreams, one belonging to America and the other to the immigrants who believed in it. America promised opportunity. But for men like Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in the poverty of Sicily, that promise came with conditions. The doors of legitimate power were closed. Respect, wealth, and freedom were reserved for others. So they built their own system, one that mirrored the American corporate world but operated in shadows. Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He was an architect who designed that system brick by brick, blood by blood. The 1920s was an era of contradiction. The government had outlawed alcohol, yet everyone wanted to drink. Morality crusaders preached purity, while the public craved vice. Prohibition created a black market that was as lucrative as it was violent, a perfect breeding ground for men who understood risk and reward. In the midst of this chaos, Luciano saw something no one else did. Crime didn't have to be reckless. It could be managed, standardized, and scaled. To him, the underworld was an untapped industry waiting for leadership. Before Luciano, the Mafia in America was a mess, fractured clans from southern Italy still clinging to old-world vendettas. They killed for pride, for insults, for honor codes that meant nothing in modern America. It was a medieval system in an industrial age. Luciano's genius was recognizing that if these gangs could unite under business principles, partnerships, hierarchies, efficiency, they could control cities instead of streets. He dreamed of a syndicate that could run smoother than any corporation on Wall Street. But every vision requires a cost. Luciano's story is not just one of ambition. It's a story of betrayal, blood, and transformation. The boy who once carried groceries for a few cents would soon control the flow of illegal liquor, gambling, and prostitution from coast to coast. Yet, behind his charm and elegance lay a calculating mind, one that saw people as assets and loyalty as a currency that could expire at any time. Cinematically, picture this: a dimly lit office above a Manhattan nightclub. A young Luciano, well-dressed, calm, cigarette smoke curling above his head. Around him, the chaos of bootleg wars, men dying in alleyways, corrupt cops counting envelopes of cash, rival bosses plotting vengeance. But Luciano sits still, watching it all with quiet detachment. He's already planning something far bigger than street-level crime. He's thinking like an executive, not a hitman. His friends, Meyer Lansky, the brilliant Jewish strategist, and Frank Costello, the smooth political operator, understood this vision. Together, they would redefine what power looked like in the underworld. They weren't building a gang, they were building an organization, one that mirrored the boardrooms of Rockefeller and Ford. Every racket was a department. Every family a division. Every hit a corporate decision. Yet for all its structure and strategy, the foundation of Luciano's empire was human psychology. He understood fear, how to inspire it, how to disguise it as respect. He knew when to be generous, when to be cruel, and when to disappear completely. Those who met him described him as both charming and chilling, a man whose smile could disarm you even as he plotted your replacement. The irony is that Luciano's world was born from America's own contradictions. The same country that outlawed vice depended on men like him to supply it. Politicians condemned organized crime publicly while taking its money privately. Judges, policemen, and mayors all played their parts in this unspoken theater of corruption. Luciano didn't invent criminality, he simply understood America better than most, that every system has a price and every law creates an opportunity. As the 1930s loomed, his influence stretched beyond the underworld. Luciano had become a quiet force behind unions, politicians, and even entertainment. He turned the Mafia from a chaotic brotherhood into a modern institution, one that could outlast him. He once told an associate, "We run things like a business. There's no difference between us and them, except we don't wear neckties in court." But like all architects of power, Luciano's story would come full circle, from control to collapse, from the king of New York to an exile in Naples. His legacy would outlive his body, shaping the DNA of global organized crime for decades. What began as survival became empire. What began as ambition became destiny. This is the journey we're about to take, through the smoky bars of Manhattan, the blood-soaked alleys of the Castellamarese War, the lavish suites of Havana, and the cold cells of Sing Sing prison. It's a story of power built from shadows, of loyalty that bends before breaking, and of one man's relentless pursuit of control in a world that thrives on chaos. Lucky Luciano didn't just live through history, he designed it. And in the process he created a blueprint for organized crime that still shapes the underworld today. The architect of modern crime had arrived. And his empire was just beginning to rise. Before Lucky Luciano reshaped the American underworld into a streamlined empire, the landscape of organized crime was fractured, primitive, and constantly bleeding. It was a violent mosaic of ethnic enclaves, Irish gangs in Hell's Kitchen, Jewish syndicates in Brooklyn, and Italian mafiosi in Lower Manhattan, all fighting for survival, territory, and pride. There was money to be made, yes, but there was no order. No rules. No vision. Just chaos held together by fear and blood oaths. In the early 1900s, the Mafia that had crossed the Atlantic from Sicily wasn't yet the sophisticated machine it would become. It was an import of the old world, bound by superstition, secrecy, and the ancient code of omerta, the vow of silence. These early men of honor believed themselves to be descendants of a noble Sicilian tradition: loyalty above all, revenge as a duty, and respect earned through violence. But in the New World, those same values created confusion. America wasn't Sicily. The streets of New York were louder, hungrier, and ruled by opportunity, not lineage. The Italian immigrants who filled the tenements of Mulberry Street and the Lower East Side brought with them more than just poverty, they brought the need to organize. In a city where corruption thrived at every level, power didn't come from the law, it came from who could enforce their own. Each block had its protector, each neighborhood its small-time boss. Petty thieves, smugglers, enforcers, all jostled for a piece of something bigger. But their rivalries were constant, their alliances fragile. Betrayal wasn't the exception, it was the rule. The early gangs fought over scraps, gambling joints, protection rackets, and waterfront jobs. They lacked discipline and foresight. Violence wasn't strategic, it was impulsive. If someone disrespected you, you killed them. If someone cheated you, you killed them. There was no corporate structure, no division of labor. Only egos, guns, and street justice. These men lived day to day, ruled by emotions and vendettas inherited from the old country. And yet, amid this chaos, a transformation was already brewing. America's booming cities were industrializing, and with industry came opportunity, both legitimate and illicit. Prohibition was still years away, but the demand for vice was constant. Gambling, prostitution, smuggling. The politicians who publicly condemned these vices were often the same men quietly profiting from them. Bribes kept the police looking the other way. Judges were bought, elections were fixed. New York was a city of invisible deals, and whoever could organize the underworld could control the flow of its money. At the time, the Italian gangs were far from unified. The Sicilian mafiosi refused to work with non-Sicilians, and even within their own ranks, the distrust was legendary. The Neapolitans and Calabrians, despite sharing a language, were treated as outsiders. The Sicilian bosses viewed themselves as aristocrats of crime, men of honor above all others. This arrogance would later prove fatal. Then there were the other ethnic powers. The Irish controlled the docks and the police unions, the Jewish syndicates handled the financial side, numbers, smuggling routes, and loan sharking. The Italians had muscle but little organization. They had honor but no structure. And without structure, their power could never grow beyond the street. By the 1910s, two major figures dominated the Italian underworld: Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both were old-school Sicilians who saw themselves as kings in a land of gangsters. They collected tribute from smaller gangs, enforced fealty through violence, and despised anyone who challenged the traditional ways. They ruled by fear, not by vision. Every transaction came with a price. Every favor with a blood debt. It was into this world that Luciano was born. When he first stepped into the game, he saw something the old bosses couldn't. That tradition was killing them. While they were busy fighting wars of pride, others were modernizing crime itself. The Jewish gangs, led by sharp minds like Arnold Rothstein and Meyer Lansky, treated bootlegging and gambling as business ventures, investments, not feuds. They understood the economy of sin, not just its bloodline. Luciano would learn from them, adapting their methods into something uniquely his own. But before his rise, the streets were a battlefield. The years leading up to Prohibition were soaked in violence. Italian gangs fought each other in what would later be known as the Black Hand Wars, extortion schemes that terrorized immigrant neighborhoods. Victims received letters signed with a crude drawing of a black hand, demanding money under threat of death. If they didn't pay, their shops burned, or their families disappeared. The newspapers sensationalized it, painting every Italian immigrant as a potential killer. Respectable families lived in fear, while the real criminals thrived on that very reputation. Law enforcement was powerless. The police were either corrupt or terrified. Politicians exploited the immigrant fear to gain votes, promising protection that never came. This neglect gave birth to the underworld as an alternative government, a system that provided what America did not: protection, justice, and order, even if it came through violence. The Mafia filled the void left by the institutions of law. By the time Luciano came of age, this world was ripe for change. The structure existed, fragmented, unstable but present. What it lacked was leadership. A mind capable of seeing beyond the next week's profits. Someone who could unify the chaos, suppress the vendettas, and convert the old Mafia's superstition into strategy. Lucky Luciano would become that man. He was not interested in being a man of honor. He wanted to be a man of power. Where Masuria and Maranzano saw sacred codes, Luciano saw inefficiency. Where others saw blood feuds, he saw wasted profit. To him, the Mafia was not a family, it was a business waiting to be organized. The world before Luciano was violent, archaic, and unsustainable. It was the dark soil from which his empire would grow. Out of its corruption and cruelty, he would craft a new kind of order, one that replaced the sword with the handshake and the vendetta with the contract. What he would build in the coming years would change not only the face of organized crime but also the moral fabric of America itself. Before him, crime was chaos. After him, it became an institution. And that transformation, from the old world's blood feuds to the modern world's boardrooms of vice, began the moment Lucky Luciano decided to rewrite the rules of the underworld. Before he was Lucky Luciano, the feared and respected architect of organized crime, he was Salvatore Lucania, a small boy from the sun-scorched hills of Sicily. He was born in 1897 in the rural town of Lercara, a place of dust, poverty, and pride. The land was hard and so were the people. Honor mattered more than comfort, and survival meant keeping your head down. His father, Antonio, worked long hours in sulfur mines, earning barely enough to feed the family. His mother, Rosalia, taught her children the old values: family first, never talk to the police, and never forget who you are. But young Salvatore had other ideas. Even as a child, he looked beyond the cracked streets of Lercara, dreaming of something bigger than the life he'd inherited. America, l'America, was the whispered promise that drifted through every Sicilian kitchen at the time. It was the land where you could make a fortune if you were clever, tough, and willing to do what others wouldn't. In 1906, when Salvatore was just 9 years old, the Lucania family packed what little they had and boarded a ship bound for New York. They arrived at Ellis Island like thousands of other immigrants, hopeful, exhausted, and unaware that they were stepping into a world far harsher than the one they had left behind. The Lower East Side of Manhattan was their new home, a neighborhood bursting with energy, noise, and struggle. Tenement buildings leaned against each other like exhausted giants, their walls sweating with the breath of 1,000 lives. Street vendors shouted in broken English, children ran barefoot through alleys, and the smell of garbage and ambition hung in the air. This was the America the immigrants found, not the America they were promised. For the Lucania family, life was survival. Antonio found work as a laborer, Rosalia took in laundry. Young Salvatore was enrolled in public school, but the language barrier and the cruelty of other kids made it nearly impossible to stay. He didn't understand English, and when he spoke Italian, he was mocked and beaten. One day, after a particularly vicious fight, he walked out of school and never returned. He was only 14. That decision, simple, impulsive, set the course for everything that followed. The streets became his classroom. The gangs became his teachers. And the lessons were brutal. The Lower East Side was divided by ethnicity. The Jews had their blocks, the Irish had theirs, and the Italians had what was left. Each group fought for control, for respect, and for money. Salvatore, small but sharp, quickly learned how the system worked. Protection rackets, card games, dice hustles. Every corner had its economy. He started small, charging other kids 5 cents for protection on their way to school. If they didn't pay, his friends made sure they remembered to next time. That was his first taste of power, not the kind you inherit but the kind you take. As he grew older, he changed his name to something that sounded more American: Charles. It made business easier and drew less attention. But among his Italian friends, he was still Salvatore. And soon, among the gangsters of New York, he would be known by another name: Lucky. The name came from an event that could have killed him. In his teenage years, Luciano was kidnapped by rival gangsters, beaten nearly to death, and dumped on Staten Island. No one knows for certain what caused the attack. Maybe a deal gone bad, maybe a message from someone higher up. But he survived. His attackers were never found. The newspapers called it a miracle. He called it destiny. From that day forward he was Lucky, a name that would stick to him like armor. Luck, however, was only part of the story. Luciano's real weapon was his intelligence, a cold, streetwise understanding of human behavior. He knew how to make people like him fear him and trust him, sometimes all at once. He dressed sharply even when broke, spoke softly when others shouted, and made deals instead of enemies. Where most gangsters relied on intimidation, Luciano relied on persuasion. He understood that charm could be more powerful than a gun, and that in business, even criminal business, relationships were currency. It was around this time that Luciano met two young men who would shape his destiny, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky was Jewish, quiet, analytical, a mathematical genius with a mind for numbers and strategy. Siegel was wild, violent, and unpredictable, a man of impulse and charisma. Together they formed an unlikely alliance, the Italian, the Jew, and the madman. In a world divided by race and tradition they saw something bigger, opportunity. Luciano and Lansky became lifelong partners. They understood each other's ambitions, to move beyond petty crime and create something lasting. Lansky once said, "Charlie had the brains for business and I had the numbers. Together we could make the streets work for us." Their friendship defied the racial boundaries that dominated the underworld. It also foreshadowed Luciano's future, one where he would unite rival factions under a single criminal empire. By the late 1910s, Luciano was working with the likes of Arnold Rothstein, the legendary gambler and fixer who had allegedly rigged the 1919 World Series. Rothstein introduced Luciano to the upper levels of corruption, how to bribe police, launder money, and invest in legitimate fronts. Luciano was no longer a street thug. He was learning how power operated in America. He watched how the wealthy moved money invisibly, how they bent the law without breaking it. He realized that the real game wasn't fought with bullets, it was fought with influence. Psychologically, something shifted within him during these years. The boy who once fought for survival began to crave control. He no longer just wanted money, he wanted order, the kind of structure that could outlive any single man. He saw the potential to turn street crime into a system, to take the unpredictability of gang life and replace it with rules, hierarchy, and logic. But even visionaries have limits. In the 1920s, Luciano was still a rising soldier, working under Joe Masuria, one of the last old-world mafia bosses. Masuria's empire was built on fear and tradition, everything Luciano despised. But for now he played the loyal lieutenant, watching and waiting. Behind the smooth suits and calm demeanor, the street kid from Sicily still lived inside him. The boy who had been beaten for speaking his own language, who had clawed his way out of poverty with nothing but his wits. He carried that hunger into every deal, every conversation, every risk. In the streets of New York, Lucky Luciano had learned the most important lesson of all, that the world respected power, not birth, not honor, but control. And he was ready to take it. What began as a boy's rebellion against poverty was turning into a man's blueprint for dominance. The Lower East Side had given him everything he needed: fear, cunning, alliances, and ambition. The streets had made him. Now he would use them to build an empire. By the time Charles Lucky Luciano entered his 20s, New York City was pulsing with illegal opportunity. The year was 1919, and the streets were shifting under the weight of a new law that would soon change everything: the Volstead Act. Prohibition was coming. Alcohol, the lifeblood of social America, was about to become contraband. And for a man like Luciano that meant only one thing: profit. But before he could build an empire he had to learn the game, and the game was brutal. Luciano's early years in organized crime were a masterclass in ambition, patience, and survival. He started at the bottom, running errands and collecting debts for Joe Masuria, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses. Masuria was an old-school Sicilian, heavy-set, superstitious, and obsessed with power. He ran his organization like a medieval fiefdom, demanding loyalty through fear rather than respect. For Masuria, tradition was sacred. For Luciano, it was an obstacle. Working under Masuria exposed Luciano to the rot at the heart of the old mafia system. Meetings conducted in whispers, decisions made out of paranoia, and endless disputes settled with bullets instead of brains. The old dons ruled through intimidation, but they were blind to efficiency. Luciano took note of every flaw, every wasted opportunity, every unnecessary feud. He wasn't content to be another soldier. He was observing, analyzing, preparing for something bigger. During this period, Luciano perfected his most dangerous skill, adaptation. He understood people better than anyone around him. He knew when to flatter, when to intimidate, and when to wait. He built relationships not just within the Italian underworld but across ethnic lines. His friendship with Meyer Lansky deepened, and together they created a new kind of criminal alliance, one based on business, not blood. In the smoky backrooms of Lower Manhattan, these young men were rewriting the rules. Lansky handled the numbers, keeping the books clean and the profits hidden. Luciano handled the diplomacy, smoothing over rivalries, keeping deals alive, and negotiating with Jewish, Irish, and even African-American gangs. To him, race and origin meant nothing compared to money. Where old Sicilians saw betrayal in working with outsiders, Luciano saw expansion. Prohibition soon turned New York into a kingdom of opportunity. Alcohol flowed through hidden channels. Smuggled from Canada, brewed in basements, and distributed through speakeasies that dotted every neighborhood. The profits were staggering. A bottle that cost $1 legally could fetch 20 on the black market. Entire fortunes were being made overnight, and the men who controlled the flow controlled the city. Luciano quickly became indispensable in this new economy. He brokered deals between bootlegging crews, managed transportation routes, and kept corrupt cops on the payroll. He wasn't just moving liquor, he was building a network. His genius wasn't in violence, it was in logistics. He treated every racket like a business division, ensuring the right people were paid, the right doors stayed open, and the right enemies were silenced quietly. Still, life in the underworld was never safe. Rivalries were constant, and one bad deal could mean a bullet to the head. In 1929, Luciano learned this lesson in the most personal way. One night he was kidnapped by a group of men, reportedly police officers working for rival gangsters, who beat him savagely, stabbed him, and dumped his body on Staten Island, assuming he was dead. Somehow he survived. When asked later how he'd lived, Luciano smirked and said, "I guess I'm just lucky." That near-death experience marked a turning point. Physically, it left scars that never faded. Psychologically, it hardened him. He began to see death not as a threat but as a companion, always near, always possible, but never something to fear. From then on, his decisions carried a chilling calmness. Emotion had no place in business. Fear was for amateurs. After his recovery, Luciano returned to the streets with renewed purpose. He had been given, as he saw it, a second life, and he intended to use it. He began quietly consolidating his influence, positioning himself between powerful figures like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two rival bosses locked in a deadly struggle for control of New York's Italian underworld. Luciano worked with both, feeding each information while keeping his own ambitions hidden. He was a double agent in a war for the city's soul. He also expanded his partnerships beyond bootlegging. Luciano moved into gambling and narcotics, seeing early that diversification was key to survival. He invested in speakeasies, nightclubs, and even legitimate businesses to launder profits. Where others saw criminality, he saw infrastructure. Every deal, every handshake, was another brick in the invisible empire he was building. To outsiders, Luciano was calm, collected, and charming, a young man who wore tailored suits and spoke with quiet confidence. But beneath that polish was a mind always calculating risk versus reward. He avoided unnecessary violence, preferring to buy loyalty instead of enforcing it through terror. It was a radical approach for the time, one that earned him both admiration and suspicion. Even law enforcement, deeply entangled with corruption, began to recognize his rising influence. Luciano wasn't the loudest or most visible gangster, but whispers of his name circulated through every precinct and political backroom. Cops took his money, judges accepted his gifts, and politicians used his funds to secure elections. Luciano understood something profound. That power wasn't about guns or muscle, it was about access. Still, for all his growing success, Luciano remained technically a subordinate under Joe Masuria. The old boss demanded loyalty, calling him Charlie Lucky, as both a compliment and a reminder of rank. But Luciano knew that the days of men like Masuria were numbered. The underworld was evolving. The old guard's obsession with bloodlines and traditions couldn't compete with the ruthless efficiency of organized enterprise. By the end of the 1920s, Luciano had completed his apprenticeship. He had learned every angle of the trade, from extortion to smuggling, bribery to murder. More importantly, he had learned what not to do. He had watched bosses fall to pride, greed, or paranoia. He had seen alliances collapse over petty feuds. He knew that if he wanted to build something lasting, it couldn't be based on fear alone. He was ready, not just to lead but to revolutionize. The apprenticeship of crime had given him the blueprint. Now he would use it to create something the world had never seen before. A criminal organization that functioned like a corporation with structure, hierarchy, and shared profit. In the dim light of backroom bars and smoke-filled offices, Luciano began to draw invisible lines of power, connecting bootleggers to bankers, hitmen to politicians. Each connection was deliberate, each alliance strategic. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was designing. And in his design, every man had a role, every dollar had a purpose, and every act of violence was just another calculated move on a vast, unseen chessboard. The street kid from Sicily was gone. In his place stood a strategist, calm, composed, and unstoppable. Lucky Luciano had graduated from the school of crime. And soon he would build his own empire, one that would turn the underworld into an institution and its chaos into order. When the 18th Amendment took effect in January 1920, America tried to cleanse itself. The government had declared war on alcohol, believing that outlawing liquor would purify society, end crime, restore morality, and save the nation's soul. But instead, it gave birth to the greatest criminal boom in American history. Prohibition didn't erase vice, it industrialized it. Overnight, millions of Americans became lawbreakers. Working men wanted a drink after long shifts, socialites still threw cocktail parties, and jazz bars flourished in secret. Alcohol went underground, and in its place, a new empire emerged, one not ruled by laws but by men like Lucky Luciano. For Luciano, prohibition wasn't a moral crusade, it was a business opportunity dressed as chaos. The streets of New York transformed into veins of profit. Speakeasies sprouted behind laundromats, under butcher shops, and in backroom restaurants. There were an estimated 30,000 illegal drinking joints across the city by 1925, and someone had to supply them. That someone was Luciano and his network. He wasn't the first to enter the liquor trade, but he was among the smartest. Early bootleggers made fortunes and enemies in equal measure. They fought bloody turf wars, hijacked shipments, and burned each other's warehouses. Luciano watched all of it and saw a different way. He didn't want to fight over slices, he wanted to own the bakery. To do that, he built partnerships across ethnic lines, something unheard of in that era. He worked with Irish mobsters who controlled the docks, Jewish financiers who managed smuggling routes, and corrupt politicians who made the police look the other way. Luciano's genius wasn't just in making money, it was in uniting men who had no reason to trust one another. At the heart of his operation was efficiency. He treated bootlegging like a legitimate industry, complete with supply chains and quality control. Liquor flowed in from Canada via the Great Lakes, or from rum-running ships just off the New Jersey coast. His men handled distribution, delivery, and collection with precision. A single shipment might change hands a dozen times before reaching a bar in Manhattan, each layer insulating Luciano from exposure. If one crew got caught, they couldn't trace it back to him. But it wasn't all business meetings and bribes. The bootlegging world was drenched in blood. Rival gangs, desperate to control territory, unleashed waves of violence that turned New York into a war zone. Trucks were hijacked, warehouses torched, drivers gunned down in broad daylight. The city police were overwhelmed, the newspapers called it the Whiskey Wars. Luciano understood that chaos was bad for business. He despised unnecessary violence, not out of morality but practicality. Every killing drew attention. Every feud invited the law. To Luciano, peace was profitable. He began mediating between gangs, resolving disputes through negotiation rather than bloodshed. Slowly, the pattern of random violence gave way to an uneasy order, one that he quietly orchestrated from the shadows. While others flaunted their wealth, Luciano moved discreetly. He dressed like a businessman, not a gangster. He spent his nights at the finest nightclubs, rubbing shoulders with politicians, actors, and Wall Street brokers. Everyone wanted to know Lucky Luciano, the smooth, handsome man with the easy smile and the endless supply of fine liquor. He became a symbol of the era, part outlaw, part entrepreneur, all charisma. Behind the charm, though, was a ruthless strategist. Luciano ensured every politician who mattered was on his payroll. He funneled cash into police precincts, district attorneys' offices, and city hall campaigns. Nothing moved in New York without his silent approval. In a sense, he had done what the government couldn't: regulate the illegal liquor trade. The irony was inescapable. While Washington preached temperance, New York drank more than ever. The very law meant to destroy vice had made men like Luciano richer than the legitimate businessmen of the time. For every dry sermon on morality, there was a hidden bar selling bootleg champagne, and Luciano's fingerprints were on every bottle. He also diversified early, reinvesting bootlegging profits into other rackets. Gambling, prostitution, narcotics, all grew under his careful supervision. Unlike the older mobsters who saw crime as a way to live day to day, Luciano saw it as a portfolio. Each racket was an investment, each partner a shareholder. He was building something sustainable, an underworld that could survive beyond prohibition itself. But power always attracts enemies. Joe Masuria, the Sicilian boss under whom Luciano still technically served, began demanding a larger share of profits. Masuria viewed Luciano's independence as disloyalty, his alliances with non-Italians as betrayal. He couldn't understand that the world was changing, that the future of organized crime wasn't about Sicilian bloodlines but about efficiency, influence, and adaptation. Luciano played along, pretending obedience while quietly expanding his network. He met with rivals, brokers, and lawmen in secret, often using Lansky as a middleman. He was positioning himself not just as a bootlegger but as a power broker, the man everyone needed, the one no one could move against directly. By the late 1920s, the profits from bootlegging were astronomical. Luciano and his allies controlled a supply chain worth millions of dollars per month. Trucks rolled through the night with whiskey hidden under crates of fruit or sacks of flour. Federal agents raided warehouses, but new ones appeared the next morning. The city was addicted, not to liquor but to the system that delivered it. And that system had one invisible architect. Luciano had learned to turn the law's failures into opportunity, to make morality itself a commodity. He didn't care whether a law was right or wrong. He only cared whether it could be used. Prohibition for him wasn't a rebellion, it was economics. Where others saw risk, he saw infrastructure. Where others spilled blood, he built networks. This was the period when the legend of Lucky Luciano began to solidify, the gangster who didn't act like one, the man who preferred deals over gunfights. He had risen from the tenements to the penthouses, from carrying bottles for tips to commanding fleets of trucks filled with contraband. Prohibition was the furnace that forged his empire. It gave him the tools, the partners, and the power to reshape organized crime forever. And as the decade drew to a close, with fortunes made and lives lost in the pursuit of illegal liquor, Luciano looked around and realized something profound. The chaos of prohibition had given him the one thing no gangster before him had ever possessed: control. The street wars had made him a soldier. The bootlegging era had made him a businessman. Now he was ready to become something far greater, the man who would take the scattered gangs of New York and turn them into a single, unified machine. The age of Lucky Luciano had begun. By the early 1930s, New York's criminal underworld was bursting at the seams, rich, violent, and dangerously unstable. The money from prohibition had made gangsters powerful, but it had also made them reckless. The city was a chessboard of rival factions. Old-world Sicilians clinging to fading traditions, ambitious young bosses hungry for territory, and a new generation of gangsters like Lucky Luciano, men who saw beyond the blood feuds and superstition. Luciano had spent years learning how chaos worked, and now he was ready to organize it. The underworld didn't need more soldiers or more guns. It needed management. It needed a system. And in his mind, that system would mirror the structure of corporate America. A board of directors, a chain of command, and divisions of power that ensured profit, not pointless vendetta. To build that system, Luciano had to eliminate the last obstacles of the old guard. The two great titans of Sicilian tradition still dominated the Italian Mafia in New York: Joe, the boss Masuria, and his rival, Salvatore Maranzano. Both were men trapped in the past, obsessed with honor, distrustful of outsiders, and unwilling to share control. Their feud, known as the Castellamarese War, had turned the city into a killing field. Soldiers vanished daily, allies switched sides overnight, and families were torn apart in the name of respect. Luciano played both sides masterfully. Publicly he was loyal to Masuria. Privately he was already negotiating with Maranzano. He promised to help end the war in exchange for a place in the new order. But his true loyalty was to something neither man understood: the idea of a modern, organized criminal enterprise that functioned like a business. In 1931, Luciano made his move. During a quiet afternoon lunch at a Coney Island restaurant, Joe Masuria was shot to death while playing cards. Luciano had excused himself to use the restroom moments before the bullets flew. When he returned, his mentor was slumped over the table, dead. It was one of the most decisive and bloodless coups in Mafia history, a clean transition from the old world to the new. Maranzano took control of New York's underworld, declaring himself Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. He introduced Roman-style hierarchy into the Mafia, complete with ranks like soldato, capo regime, and consigliere. On paper it looked efficient. In practice it was tyranny disguised as order. Maranzano saw himself as emperor and everyone else as his subjects. For Luciano it was déjà vu, another old man ruling by fear, blind to the future. Within months, Luciano decided that Maranzano had to go too. But unlike the brutal wars of the past, this would be an execution disguised as evolution. Using the same subtlety that had made him indispensable, Luciano arranged for Maranzano's death in his own office, carried out by Jewish hitmen posing as federal agents, a symbolic end to the Mafia's isolationism. The message was clear: the era of the old bosses was over. With both Masuria and Maranzano gone, Luciano stepped into the vacuum. He refused the title of boss of bosses, calling it outdated and dangerous. Instead he proposed something revolutionary: the Commission, a governing council of Mafia families designed to keep peace, mediate disputes and distribute territory fairly. It was the first time in American history that organized crime had a functional, governing structure. At the heart of this system were 5 families, each autonomous, each powerful, but all bound by shared interests. The families of New York were led by Luciano himself, Tommy Gagliano, Joseph Prophesai, Vincent Mangano, and Al Scarface Capone's ally in exile, Frank Costello. Together, they represented a balance of power that transformed the Mafia from a loose collection of gangs into a national syndicate. Under this new model, violence became regulated. Murders required approval from the Commission. Wars were discouraged because they disrupted business. Profits were shared, investments were pooled, and disputes were handled like corporate disagreements. The Mafia, under Luciano's blueprint, became the shadow version of American capitalism: ruthless, efficient, and organized. Luciano's own family became the prototype. He promoted professionalism over emotion, discipline over tradition. Soldiers were expected to behave like businessmen: punctual, reliable, and discreet. Anyone who brought unnecessary attention to the organization was swiftly removed. He banned kidnappings and unsanctioned killings, believing they were bad for business. To Luciano, the Mafia wasn't about pride or revenge, it was about control. His consigliere, Frank Costello, handled the political front, bribing judges, funding elections, and embedding Mafia influence deep into the city's infrastructure. Meyer Lansky, though not Italian and therefore not technically a made man, acted as the financial strategist, managing investments and laundering profits through casinos and real estate. It was a hybrid model, part Sicilian tradition, part Wall Street efficiency, and it worked. For the first time, the Mafia operated with the precision of a multinational corporation. Luciano's empire stretched far beyond New York. The Commission coordinated with crime bosses in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Los Angeles. The Mafia had become a national network with centralized leadership and decentralized operations. Luciano was no longer just a gangster, he was the CEO of American crime. What set him apart was his vision. He didn't see the Mafia as something confined to Italian immigrants or back-alley enforcers. He saw it as an industry that could adapt and survive through any era, from bootlegging to gambling, from labor racketeering to drug smuggling. Every illegal market was, in his eyes, a business opportunity waiting to be formalized. Psychologically, Luciano was both pragmatic and paradoxical. He respected the Mafia's Sicilian roots but had no patience for its outdated codes. He believed in loyalty but not blind obedience. He was ruthless when necessary, but his violence was always calculated, never personal. His charisma drew people in, his intellect kept them there. Even rivals admired his discipline. Under his leadership, the underworld thrived. The Mafia had become something almost invisible, woven into the fabric of the American economy. Labor unions, construction contracts, nightclubs, trucking companies, all were quietly under Mafia influence. Politicians sought his favor, businessmen sought his connections. Luciano's model blurred the line between legitimate enterprise and criminal empire. But with success came exposure. The newspapers began referring to him as the Napoleon of crime, a flattering but dangerous title. Federal agents who had long been one step behind were beginning to notice that the violence had decreased while profits had multiplied, a sure sign that someone had brought order to the chaos. Luciano's rise was both elegant and chilling. He had achieved what few criminals ever do. He had made crime respectable. The Mafia was no longer seen as a collection of thugs but as a sophisticated underground economy. It had hierarchy, diplomacy, and even rules of engagement. And yet, for all its sophistication, the system was built on fear, not of violence but of irrelevance. Every man in Luciano's world understood that power came not from killing, but from staying useful. The moment you stopped being valuable, you stopped existing. Luciano's creation, the Five Families and the Commission, was the most efficient criminal organization the world had ever seen. It turned murder into management, greed into governance, and corruption into an art form. But power, no matter how carefully managed, always attracts its own downfall. As Luciano's empire expanded, so did the attention of law enforcement and politicians eager to make their careers by taking him down. For now, though, Luciano stood at the peak of his creation, calm, methodical, untouchable. He had brought peace to the streets and profit to the underworld. In a city built on ambition, he had become its most flawless mirror, ruthless, strategic, and endlessly adaptable. The Mafia was no longer just an organization, it was an institution. And at its head sat Lucky Luciano, the man who had turned crime into business, and business into an empire. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's criminal empire stretched from the streets of New York to the boardrooms of Las Vegas and beyond. To the outside world he was untouchable, the invisible hand guiding organized crime like a corporate magnate steering an empire. But behind that aura of control was a delicate web of alliances and rivalries, all held together by Luciano's charisma, cunning, and absolute willingness to remove anyone who threatened his vision. Every powerful man knows that power itself is fragile. Luciano understood this better than anyone. His empire wasn't a fortress, it was a balancing act. Each ally he made was also a potential traitor. Each handshake could one day hide a knife. Among his most trusted allies stood Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Costello was everything Luciano admired in a man, refined, diplomatic, and discreet. He understood politics the way Luciano understood the streets. Together, they formed an unbreakable duo. Luciano controlled the criminal infrastructure while Costello controlled the politicians who made it possible. Costello's connections reached deep into Tammany Hall, the democratic machine that ruled New York City politics. Judges, cops, and even mayors quietly worked under their influence. Then there was Meyer Lansky, the Jewish mastermind of finance. To Luciano, Lansky wasn't just a partner. He was proof that intelligence mattered more than ethnicity. Lansky managed money with surgical precision, laundering millions through legitimate businesses and international accounts. It was Lansky who helped Luciano see that crime could be global, that it could be run like a multinational enterprise long before the concept existed. And finally there was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's volatile counterpart. Siegel was everything Luciano wasn't: impulsive, flamboyant, and dangerous. But he was also fearless, and in a world where fear dictated loyalty, that made him invaluable. Siegel became Luciano's enforcer and ambassador, opening doors that required more muscle than charm. Together, these men formed the modern foundation of organized crime, a network bound not by blood but by shared ambition. They were businessmen in tailored suits, building empires from the ashes of prohibition. But not everyone was loyal to the new order. Beneath the polished surface of Luciano's syndicate simmered resentment and suspicion. Some old-school gangsters despised Luciano's partnerships with non-Italians. To them, the Mafia was sacred, a Sicilian institution corrupted by outsiders. Men like Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Vito Genovese played the game on Luciano's terms but kept their daggers close. Vito Genovese, in particular, embodied the quiet threat that haunted Luciano's empire. He had served as Luciano's underboss and trusted lieutenant, calculating, ambitious, and utterly remorseless. But unlike Luciano, Genovese had no interest in diplomacy or innovation. He craved power for its own sake. To him, alliances were temporary, and leadership was a prize to be seized, not earned. Genovese would smile in Luciano's presence, speak of loyalty and respect, but his eyes were always fixed on the throne. Luciano knew this and tolerated it. He believed that keeping enemies close was safer than banishing them. But he underestimated how deeply Genovese's envy would run. Meanwhile, outside forces were beginning to close in. The 1930s brought a new kind of enemy: law enforcement with public backing. Fiorello LaGuardia, the reformist mayor of New York, declared war on organized crime. Federal prosecutors, emboldened by the end of Prohibition, were hungry for new victories. And leading that crusade was a man who would become Luciano's most dangerous adversary, Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was everything Luciano's empire feared: young, incorruptible, and relentless. He didn't care about payoffs or backroom deals. He wanted headlines, justice, and the dismantling of organized vice in New York City. To Dewey, Lucky Luciano wasn't just a criminal, He was a symbol of everything wrong with America's moral decay. As Dewey rose through the ranks, Luciano's network began to feel the heat. Raids increased. Informants whispered. Brothels and gambling dens, once untouchable, were now targets of systematic investigation. Luciano's meticulous structure was suddenly vulnerable to something he couldn't control: public outrage. The irony was brutal. Luciano had spent a decade turning organized crime into a business, but it was one of his most respectable businesses, prostitution, that would become his undoing. In the mid-1930s, Dewey launched a campaign to clean up the city's sex trade, targeting high-end prostitution rings that operated under Mafia protection. Luciano's name surfaced repeatedly in testimonies, linking him to an extensive network of brothels run through intermediaries. At first, Luciano dismissed it as political noise, the kind of heat that came and went. But Dewey was not like other prosecutors. He wasn't after the pimps, he was after the kingpin. Within Luciano's circle, paranoia began to spread. Some of his partners grew nervous. Others considered cutting ties. Even Lansky, the cool-headed strategist, advised Luciano to lie low and reduce visibility. But Lucky had never been the hiding type. He believed his influence still bought him protection. After all, hadn't he survived worse? The danger, however, wasn't just external. Inside his empire, cracks were forming. Genovese had started whispering in back rooms, hinting that Luciano's time was ending, that the boss had gotten soft, too comfortable, too public. And while Genovese maneuvered in the shadows, another blow came from a direction no one expected: betrayal from within the city's vice network. A woman named Cokie Flo Brown, a madam caught in one of Dewey's raids, began cooperating with the prosecution. Under pressure, she and others testified that Luciano was the hidden force behind New York's prostitution empire. It was thin evidence by modern standards, but in the 1930s public morality carried more weight than proof. Luciano's empire had always depended on silence, the code of omerta. But silence can't survive when fear changes sides. By 1936, Dewey had built enough of a case to indict Luciano on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. It was a sensational move, the first time in U.S. history that a mafia boss of his caliber faced direct prosecution. Newspapers ran lurid headlines. Politicians celebrated. And in the corridors of power, men who once took Luciano's money suddenly forgot his name. Inside his circle, loyalty fractured. Costello remained steadfast. Lansky did what he could behind the scenes. But others, sensing the empire shaking, began preparing for a future without Lucky. Even as Luciano publicly denied all charges, he could feel the tide turning. The alliances that had built his kingdom were dissolving under the glare of the law. And yet, even as enemies surrounded him, Luciano remained composed. He had risen from the streets by understanding one universal truth: power doesn't vanish, it transfers. He told Lansky quietly one night, "They can lock me up, but they can't lock up what we built." In that statement lay the essence of his empire, a system so deeply woven into America's fabric that no single man, not even Lucky Luciano, was indispensable. Still, for the first time in his life, Luciano wasn't in control. The alliances that once made him invincible had become liabilities. The enemies he had tolerated were now circling. The man who had unified the underworld was about to face his greatest test, not on the streets but in a courtroom against the full power of the state. And this time, the war would not be fought with bullets, but with words, witnesses, and the slow erosion of silence. By 1936, Lucky Luciano had become both a myth and a menace, a man who embodied everything modern America admired and feared: power without accountability. For over a decade, he had built an empire in plain sight, a criminal corporation that operated more efficiently than many legitimate businesses. But empires, no matter how invisible, leave trails. And in a city brimming with corruption, the trail led straight to him. This was no longer a war of gangsters, it was a war of perception. On one side stood the state, armed with laws, headlines, and moral outrage. On the other stood Luciano, the silent monarch of the underworld, fighting not for turf or money this time, but for survival. Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious special prosecutor, had made Luciano his mission. To Dewey, taking down Lucky Luciano wasn't just a legal pursuit, it was a crusade. He wanted to prove that no man, no matter how rich or connected, was above the law. His team had spent months gathering testimonies, building a narrative that portrayed Luciano as the secret overlord of New York's prostitution rings. The evidence was circumstantial at best. Luciano had insulated himself carefully, his hands were clean on paper. But Dewey's genius was not in what he could prove, it was in what he could convince the public to believe. And in the moral climate of the 1930s, the accusation itself was enough to damn a man. For the first time, Luciano faced an opponent who didn't play by the underworld's rules. Bribes didn't work. Threats didn't stick. There was no one to buy, no one to intimidate. Dewey was incorruptible, and that made him dangerous. Luciano tried to retreat into the shadows, to let his lawyers handle the noise. But the walls were closing in. Dewey's raids had paralyzed his network. Brothel operators were vanishing into witness protection, and frightened lieutenants were making deals to save themselves. Luciano's empire, built on silence, was crumbling under the weight of testimony. In April 1936, Dewey's agents made their move. Luciano, who had fled to Hot Springs, Arkansas in a last attempt to disappear, was arrested in his suite at the Hotel National. The image of him being led away in handcuffs became front-page news, the mighty gangster finally caught. To the public, it was the triumph of law over lawlessness. But to those who knew Luciano, it was something else entirely, a man finally losing control of the narrative he had so carefully written. The hidden war wasn't just the courtroom battle that followed. It was the quiet, psychological war playing out in Luciano's mind. For years he had defined his world through control, controlling men, money, and outcomes. Now, for the first time, he was at the mercy of a system he couldn't manipulate. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens ready to immortalize every glance, every smirk. The prosecution painted Luciano as a moral plague, a man who had corrupted the very soul of the city. Witness after witness described him as a shadowy puppet master, the man who decided which women worked where, who paid protection, and who lived or died in the vice trade. Luciano's defense argued that he was a victim of hysteria, that no tangible proof connected him to the brothels. His lawyers pointed out the absurdity. Not a single document, phone record, or eyewitness placed Luciano in the operations Dewey described. But in the theater of justice, facts often matter less than stories. And Dewey's story was airtight. He cast Luciano as the architect of a moral disease infecting America, a narrative that appealed to a nation struggling through the Great Depression, desperate for heroes and villains. The jury didn't see a businessman or a strategist, they saw the face of corruption itself. Throughout the trial, Luciano sat calm and collected, his expression unreadable. He wore tailored suits and smiled politely at the cameras, as though the entire proceeding were beneath him. But beneath that calm he was calculating. He still believed he could outthink the system, that some deal would emerge, that money or influence could still turn the tide. But this was a different battlefield. His old tactics were obsolete. The very things that had made him untouchable, secrecy, fear, and control, were now useless against the relentless machinery of public justice. In June 1936, after an intense, highly publicized trial, the verdict came, guilty on 62 counts. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. The courtroom erupted. Dewey was hailed as a national hero. The papers declared it, the end of the Mafia. But even as Luciano was led away, handcuffed and silent, there was an odd calm in his eyes. Those who knew him swore he didn't look defeated. If anything, he looked thoughtful, as if already strategizing from within his cell. Because Lucky Luciano understood something most men didn't. Power doesn't disappear when you lose control. It just shifts. Behind prison walls, he still had influence. His associates still ran the streets, and his lieutenants, men like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, ensured that the empire continued to function. Luciano's imprisonment didn't dismantle the Mafia, it legitimized it. By removing himself from the front lines, he had inadvertently made the organization more autonomous, more resilient. Meanwhile, outside, the underworld began to reorganize. Without Luciano's iron hand, rival bosses started vying for dominance. Vito Genovese, who had fled to Italy to avoid prosecution, was already plotting his return. Others whispered that Luciano's conviction was only temporary, that one way or another, he'd find his way back. For the government, Luciano's imprisonment was a victory. For the Mafia, it was a reorganization. The hidden war, between visibility and control, between law and influence, continued quietly, unseen by the public. Even behind bars, Luciano remained a phantom presence. Orders still came, deals were still made, and respect for Charlie Lucky never waned. His name became legend, the fallen king who ruled from a cell. And yet, beneath the myth, there was the man, restless, reflective, and increasingly aware that his war with the system was far from over. He began to see that power wasn't only about fear or force. It was about adaptability. The hidden war had taught him something profound. You can cage a man but not a network. You can silence a name but not the system it created. In the end, Thomas Dewey might have won the legal battle. But the Mafia, the system Luciano had built, refined and professionalized, had already transcended any single man. It was bigger than him now. Luciano had lost his freedom, but his creation lived on, evolving, spreading, adapting. And soon enough, history would offer him a chance to reclaim his influence in the most unexpected way possible, through a secret alliance that would change the course of both the Mafia and the U.S. government. Because even in defeat, Lucky Luciano was never truly out of the game. He was simply waiting for the next move. The clang of the prison gates at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, echoed like a prophecy, the sound of a king entering exile. For most men, a 30 to 50-year sentence meant the end of everything. But Charles Lucky Luciano was not most men. As the heavy doors closed behind him, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about control, how to maintain it, how to bend even confinement into strategy. In the public eye, Luciano's conviction was a complete fall from grace. The once untouchable emperor of the underworld, now stripped of his silk suits and locked behind bars, had become a symbol of justice served. Newspapers printed his mugshot next to words like Vice King and Luciano Falls. To the average citizen it was over, a clean ending to a dirty story. But inside the Mafia things were far more complicated. The fall of Luciano created a power vacuum, and in the criminal world, nature abhors a vacuum. At first, Frank Costello stepped in to handle business on Luciano's behalf. Costello had the mind of a diplomat and the instincts of a politician. He knew how to keep the machine running quietly. Under his guidance, the Mafia stayed stable, operating as if Luciano were still at the helm. Costello's steady hand prevented the kind of chaos that usually followed a boss's downfall. But others saw Luciano's imprisonment as an opportunity. Chief among them was Vito Genovese, the patient predator who had long waited for his chance. Genovese had fled to Italy during the trial, claiming innocence, but his ambitions never rested. In exile, he ingratiated himself with Benito Mussolini's regime, forging new contacts and building his own brand of power. To Genovese, Luciano's imprisonment was not a tragedy, it was an opening. From behind prison walls, Luciano watched this unfold like a chess master forced to play through glass. He still received visitors, lawyers, friends and emissaries, who passed messages back and forth. Even in captivity, his influence rippled through the streets of New York. Orders were still obeyed. His name still carried weight. Yet power in the underworld is like oxygen, invisible, essential and quick to disappear when not maintained. Luciano's absence allowed other men to breathe freely. The structure he'd created, once so disciplined, began to show cracks. Some bosses ignored the commission's authority. Others pursued their own agendas. The unity that had once defined Luciano's reign was fraying. Meanwhile, the world outside was changing. The Great Depression was fading and America was gearing up for something far larger: war. Rumors of global conflict filled the air, and new opportunities and dangers loomed on the horizon. For Luciano, isolation brought clarity. In the monotony of prison life, he began to reflect on the system he had built, the organization that outlived him, the code that held it together, and the betrayals that had led him here. He didn't romanticize the Mafia the way older bosses had. To him, it was a structure, a design. But he realized, perhaps too late, that no design can survive without loyalty at its foundation. That loyalty was now crumbling. Genovese, emboldened by Luciano's absence, began spreading rumors that the former boss had lost his edge, that he'd grown soft, that his time was over. He whispered these things to soldiers, capos, anyone who would listen. In the Mafia, power is perception, and Genovese was a master manipulator. He positioned himself as the natural successor, a true Sicilian, who could restore the old traditions that Luciano had diluted by partnering with Jews and Irishmen. The irony, of course, was that Genovese owed everything to the system Luciano created. But in the underworld, gratitude was weakness and ambition was survival. From his prison cell, Luciano was forced to wage a psychological war. He sent word through trusted messengers, reminding the commission that stability depended on unity, not ego. Costello acted as his voice, but even he couldn't silence every whisper. The Mafia had grown too large, too complex. It no longer belonged to any one man. And yet, Luciano's legend only deepened. To the public he was gone. To the underworld he had become something else, an idea. His imprisonment added mystique to his name. Young gangsters spoke of him like a myth, a figure of intelligence and discipline in a world of chaos. Even the guards at Dannemora treated him with a strange respect. He carried himself with quiet authority, never pleading, never complaining. Prison didn't break him, it refined him. He read constantly, about history, business, and politics. He observed how institutions maintained order, how power operated within systems. If the streets were his first classroom, prison was his second. Occasionally he would receive coded letters from Lansky discussing business opportunities that were, of course, still criminal enterprises. Lansky's financial genius ensured Luciano's personal fortune continued to grow, hidden through offshore accounts and investments. Even stripped of freedom, Luciano was not poor. Still, the loneliness gnawed at him. His charm and cunning had always thrived in social spaces. Smoke-filled rooms, backroom deals, whispered negotiations. Behind bars the silence was different. It forced introspection. He began to see himself not as a victim of fate, but as the inevitable product of his own ambition. He had once unified men through fear and profit. Now he was learning the limits of both. Fear couldn't reach across steel bars and profit couldn't buy loyalty forever. By the early 1940s, Genovese's ambitions had taken a darker turn. While Luciano remained imprisoned, Genovese continued to maneuver, aligning himself with fascist officials in Italy, even engaging in wartime black market deals. His arrogance would eventually become his undoing, but for now, his shadow loomed large. Then, in 1942, history made an unexpected move, one that would pull Luciano back into relevance. As World War II intensified, U.S. naval intelligence began to face a serious problem. German submarines were attacking American supply ships along the East Coast, and sabotage rumors spread through the New York docks. The government needed information, control of the ports, access to the men who worked them, and someone who could reach the unseen corners of the waterfront. And there was only one man with that kind of reach: Lucky Luciano. It was the ultimate irony, the United States government turning to a convicted crime boss for help. The arrangement, later known as Operation Underworld, would mark the beginning of Luciano's redemption arc, or at least his return to power. But that story was still in the distance. For now, in his cold prison cell, Luciano sat in quiet contemplation, watching the empire he built shift and mutate without him. His fall had begun the day he trusted that fear and control would last forever. What he was learning now was something more enduring, that true power doesn't always lie in visibility. Sometimes, it survives in memory, influence, and the systems you leave behind. Luciano's body might have been imprisoned, but his design, the web of alliances, the commission, the corporate model of crime, lived on, still pulsing through the arteries of America's underworld. His fall was physical. His legacy was structural. And soon, history itself would need him, the fallen king called back from the depths to serve the very nation that had caged him. The year was 1936, and all of New York City seemed to hold its breath. The underworld's invisible ruler, Charles Lucky Luciano, was suddenly, dramatically visible. Gone were the tailored suits and silk ties, replaced by a plain gray suit and an impassive stare. The press called it the trial of the century. For a man who had spent his life mastering control behind the scenes, Luciano now found himself trapped under a spotlight that revealed everything. The indictment was shocking: 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. To the public, this was moral justice, the state striking down the man who had corrupted the city's soul. But to Luciano, it was theater, a political play directed by New York's ambitious prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was young, sharp, and utterly determined. He wasn't just chasing Luciano, he was building a name. In a time when corruption was rampant, Dewey saw Luciano as the ultimate trophy. Bringing him down would symbolize law and order reclaiming the streets from vice. And so, he assembled a case with military precision, not just against Luciano the man but Luciano the myth. The case hinged on testimony from prostitutes and madams, terrified women who claimed Luciano's organization controlled every brothel in New York. They described a vast network of pimps, collectors, and enforcers who paid tribute to the boss. Many of them had never met Luciano, but the prosecution didn't need direct evidence. They needed perception. The Mafia's code of silence made direct proof impossible. Dewey's genius was to paint Luciano as the spider at the center of the web. Each day of the trial was a performance. Dewey, in his crisp suits, spoke with moral conviction. Luciano, calm and expressionless, sat beside his lawyers like a man watching someone else's story unfold. The jury was captivated, not just by the evidence but by the myth. They weren't judging a man, they were judging the symbol of organized vice. The defense argued that Luciano was being targeted for who he was, not what he'd done. They pointed out the lack of direct proof, the contradictions in witness statements, and the implausibility of a man of Luciano's status managing the minutiae of street-level prostitution. But Dewey knew public sentiment was on his side. America was tired of corruption, tired of men who flaunted the law and prospered from it. The newspapers feasted on the spectacle. Headlines like, "Vice Czar faces justice," and "Luciano's women tell all" flooded the city. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, some jeering, some curious, all wanting to see the fall of a legend. Behind the scenes, however, the Mafia was in chaos. Luciano's closest allies, Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, scrambled to manage business, bribe officials and limit the damage. But Dewey's case was airtight enough to resist interference. For once, money couldn't buy silence. Luciano remained stoic throughout. When reporters shouted questions, he smiled faintly and said, "We'll see." It was the same calm that had guided him through gang wars and betrayals, but this was different. He was no longer in control of the board. As the trial stretched on, witnesses recounted stories of brutality, beatings, threats, and forced servitude. Dewey connected each thread back to Luciano, framing him as the unseen hand behind the system. The public lapped it up. Luciano, who had always kept his distance from street crimes, was now being depicted as their mastermind. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. Dewey stood before the jury and declared, "This man is not just another criminal. He is the reason vice exists in New York. If you believe that no man is above the law, then you must convict him." The jury deliberated for less than 9 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. Luciano, sitting with perfect composure, looked straight ahead as the foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Gasps rippled through the room. Dewey's jaw tightened, not with surprise but triumph. The judge, Charles G. Strong, wasted no time delivering the blow. 30 to 50 years in prison. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Luciano didn't flinch. He nodded slightly as if acknowledging an inevitable turn of fate. When reporters asked how he felt, he replied coolly, "I can take it. There's no such thing as life without trouble." That line would echo through newspapers the next morning, cementing his legend as the gangster who never begged, never broke. But beneath the calm exterior, something deeper stirred. Luciano wasn't angry, he was analyzing. The courtroom wasn't just a place of defeat, it was a mirror reflecting his empire's weaknesses. He had built a system designed to be untouchable, but he had underestimated the one power he couldn't control, the state's hunger for spectacle. Dewey had turned morality into a weapon and used it to pierce the armor of organized crime. Luciano, the master strategist, had been outplayed by someone who understood image as well as he understood fear. In the days following the verdict, Luciano's empire trembled but didn't collapse. Costello and Lansky moved quickly to maintain order, spreading the message that Lucky's word still counts. But everyone knew the truth, the boss was gone and no one could fill the void completely. As he was transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility, Luciano stared out the window of the transport van, watching the city fade into the distance. The skyline glowed like a memory, the place he had conquered, the empire he had designed. It was all still there, pulsing with life, but it no longer belonged to him. The press called it justice. The police called it victory. But in the underworld it was seen as betrayal, a signal that even the most powerful could fall. Rumors circulated that some witnesses had been coerced, that Dewey's team had made deals in the shadows. Yet none of it mattered. The verdict stood. Luciano's sentencing marked more than the end of a man's freedom. It marked the beginning of the Mafia's transformation. For the first time, the underworld understood the power of public image, the danger of exposure, and the need to adapt. Future bosses would operate differently, quieter, less flamboyant, more corporate. Inside his cell, Lucky Luciano sat with a cigarette and whispered to a fellow inmate, "They can lock me up, but they can't lock up what I built." He was right. Dewey might have won the battle, but Luciano's system, the commission, the business model, the very concept of organized crime, would endure, evolving beyond the reach of any prosecutor. The trial was his fall. But even in defeat, Luciano had achieved something rare. He proved that power could be designed, structured, and maintained, even from behind bars. And soon, the same government that condemned him would come knocking on his cell door, asking for his help in a time of war. Luciano's downfall wasn't the end of his story. It was merely the intermission. Prison was supposed to be the end. For most men, a 30 to 50-year sentence at Clinton Correctional Facility meant disappearing into obscurity, a forgotten name filed among thousands of others. But Lucky Luciano was not most men. Behind those gray stone walls, under the fluorescent hum of state authority, Luciano found a new kind of freedom, one born from influence rather than movement, command rather than presence. At first glance, he seemed like any other inmate, neatly dressed, quiet, reading books, playing cards. But beneath that calm exterior he was reconstructing power, the invisible kind that didn't need a gun or a street corner to function. The guards, the inmates, even the warden, all would eventually feel the subtle gravitational pull of his presence. From the beginning, Luciano understood the psychology of confinement. The first rule of survival in prison was the same as on the streets: control the environment before it controls you. Within months he had befriended key figures: inmates who managed the kitchen, clerks who handled communications, guards open to persuasion. He offered favors, protection, and, when needed, quiet intimidation. Soon his cell was not a cage, it was an office. Visitors came frequently: lawyers, relatives, business contacts, and friends, who often carried coded messages. His loyal lieutenant, Frank Costello, served as his external voice, coordinating with Meyer Lansky and other syndicate leaders to ensure the machinery of organized crime continued smoothly. The commission still met, decisions were still made, and profits still flowed, only now the ultimate approval came from behind bars. It was an extraordinary paradox. The state had imprisoned the man but could not imprison his system. Luciano's influence became almost mythic, whispered through corridors and relayed across continents. Lucky still runs things, people said in Harlem speakeasies, Chicago backrooms, Havana clubs. His empire, though invisible, was alive and thriving. Within the prison his power took on a different tone. He treated inmates with fairness and respect, often intervening to settle disputes before they turned violent. Guards noted that tension seemed to drop when Luciano was around, an unspoken acknowledgement that he brought order, even to chaos. He became a kind of unofficial governor, maintaining stability in a place built on punishment. One guard later recalled, "He never raised his voice but everyone listened when he spoke. Even the tough guys." Luciano also began reflecting deeply on the structure of his empire. He requested books on management, politics, and military strategy. He read Machiavelli's The Prince and Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War, underlining passages about leadership, discipline, and betrayal. These weren't idle curiosities, they were lessons in longevity. If his physical freedom was gone, his intellectual freedom became sharper, more deliberate. Yet even a mind like his couldn't escape the erosion of time. Days turned to months, months to years. The same routine, the same walls. There were moments, brief, unguarded, when Luciano would stare out through the barred window at the frozen landscape and whisper in Sicilian, "Questa è la vera punizione, this is the real punishment." Outside, the world shifted dramatically. World War II erupted across Europe. New York's docks became vital supply arteries for the U.S. Navy, but they were also riddled with corruption, union disputes, and whispers of sabotage. When a French ocean liner, the SS Normandy, caught fire and capsized at Pier 88 in 1942, panic spread. Was it an accident or enemy action? No one knew for sure. But one thing was certain: the Navy needed control of the docks, and fast. That's when a curious alliance began to take shape, one that would blur the line between patriotism and organized crime. Naval intelligence officers approached Meyer Lansky. They knew Lansky's reputation, not just as a financial genius, but as the man who could reach anyone. They asked if he could help secure the docks, using his connections with longshoremen and, indirectly, with the Mafia. Lansky agreed, but on one condition: that Luciano be involved. At first the idea seemed absurd. The government working with the country's most notorious gangster? But desperation breeds pragmatism. The Navy couldn't afford to lose ships to sabotage. So, quietly, discreetly, Operation Underworld was born. Through intermediaries, Luciano was approached in his cell. The offer was simple: help the U.S. government maintain order on the docks, gather intelligence in Sicily for the Allied invasion, and in return consideration would be given to his sentence. It was a devil's bargain, a fusion of crime and statecraft. Luciano accepted, not out of loyalty to the flag but out of strategy. He understood that cooperation could restore his image, reduce his sentence, and prove his continued usefulness. To him this wasn't charity, it was business. From behind bars, Luciano coordinated communication through Lansky and a network of trusted associates. The Mafia ensured dockworkers remained loyal, strikes ceased, and information flowed smoothly. When the Allies prepared to invade Sicily in 1943, Luciano's contacts in the region provided intelligence: names, routes, loyalties. Whether exaggerated or real, the operation was hailed as a success. Word spread that the man in Dannemora had helped win a piece of the war. Newspapers hinted at it, though official confirmation remained murky. But inside the government, favors were being tallied, debts quietly acknowledged. By 1945, the war was ending, and so was the patience to keep a man like Luciano locked away. His cooperation had made him useful again, and powerful men were willing to advocate for his release. Thomas Dewey, now governor of New York, the very man who had put Luciano behind bars, was persuaded to reconsider his sentence. It was an extraordinary reversal of fate. The prosecutor who had built his career on convicting Luciano was now the key to his freedom. Politics and pragmatism intertwined. Dewey justified the decision by citing Luciano's wartime assistance. On February 2, 1946, after nearly 10 years behind bars, Lucky Luciano's sentence was commuted. But there was a catch: he would never be allowed to return as a free man in America. He was to be deported to Italy. When the guards came for him that morning, Luciano dressed carefully: crisp shirt, pressed trousers, polished shoes. As he walked through the gates, reporters asked how it felt to finally be free. He smiled faintly and said, "America made me and now it's sending me home. That's fair." It was a line filled with irony and insight. Behind it was the understanding that his empire, though thriving, had outgrown him. Yet even in exile, his name would continue to cast a long shadow. In prison, Luciano had learned that true power doesn't need proximity. It needs design, influence, and memory. And those he still possessed in abundance. The ghost of Lucky Luciano was leaving the walls of Clinton Correctional Facility. But he wasn't returning to freedom. He was stepping into a new kind of empire, one without borders, one that operated on reputation alone. Behind him the gates closed. Ahead the underworld waited. When Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, freedom arrived with exile. Naples became his gilded cage, a sun-bleached city that echoed with the sounds of a life he could never truly return to. From a suite overlooking the harbor, he tried to rebuild, arranging meetings, sending coded messages, dreaming of the Havana he once ruled. Cuba became his last great gamble. In 1947 he slipped there under false papers, reuniting with Meyer Lansky to revive the casino empire. For a few months he tasted power again: white suits, jazz bands, champagne, the illusion of control. But U.S. pressure forced Batista's government to expel him. His dream of an international syndicate died on the same runway that carried him back to Naples. The years that followed were slower, quieter. He ran small enterprises, watched the mafia he built evolve without him, and saw new bosses forget his discipline. Age brought reflection, and paranoia. He feared assassination as much as obscurity. Friends noticed his voice soften, the once steel eyes dimmed with resignation. Yet he remained a legend. Reporters sought him out, scholars quoted him, and every gangster claimed to follow Lucky's way. When he spoke, it was with the calm of a man who understood that empires outlive their makers. In the end, Luciano's exile was his final punishment: to witness his creation from afar, alive but untouchable. His life had become what every architect dreads: a masterpiece that no longer needed its builder. Luciano's death in 1962 didn't end his story, it confirmed it. The commission he created endured, shaping organized crime across continents. His genius lay in turning chaos into governance, in proving that even criminals could act like CEOs. The mafia families that followed used his structure as scripture. Meetings, profits, mediations, all echoed his vision. The corporate style he introduced bled into every sphere of illicit enterprise: gambling, drugs, unions, and politics. He turned the underworld into a boardroom. His influence even reshaped law enforcement. The FBI's anti-racketeering strategy and the RICO Act were born to dismantle the very architecture he designed. Luciano had forced justice to evolve. But beyond systems and laws, his legacy is psychological. He symbolized power without chaos, intellect disguised as crime. To him, violence was management, loyalty, and investment. Every modern depiction of a Don, from Corleone to Soprano, traces its roots to him. Still, his empire carried a flaw: human greed. The discipline he preached decayed into blood feuds and betrayals. The code cracked, informants whispered. Yet even in ruin, his idea survived: the notion that control could be invisible, that order could live inside corruption. Luciano didn't just change organized crime. He revealed its mirror image in society: ambition, hierarchy, and the hunger to endure. Lucky Luciano's life ends where modern power begins. He rose from immigrant poverty to become the invisible hand behind America's criminal order. His brilliance was structural, seeing that control depended not on bullets but on systems. Exiled, he watched his empire outgrow him. The Mafia evolved, corporations imitated it, governments learned from it. His design, hierarchy, profit, discipline, became universal. He had turned sin into organization. Yet his story is also a warning. Power built on secrecy corrodes from within. Fear demands loyalty until the silence breaks. The machine he built eventually devoured its own architects. Still his ghost endures. Every movie dawn, every whispered negotiation, every hidden network owes something to his vision. He proved that ambition and morality rarely coexist, that empire always extracts a price. Luciano died of a heart attack in Naples after greeting a film producer, moments before telling his story to the world. Poetic justice, the man who built his legend died at its edge. His tombstone bears only Charles Luciano. No epitaph, because he needs none. The structure he designed speaks for him. He didn't invent crime. He systemized it. And in doing so, he built the blueprint that still defines the shadow side of modern power.